All right, well, my name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester. Today's the 19th of December, 2018, and you're joining into the Forest Connect webinar series. We are fortunate to have a lot of different very talented speakers. Today we have a repeat talented speaker. Dave Jackson has been a presenter many times over the years and always does a great job, has a great topic, and is a really fun interaction with Dave in the audience. So Dave's going to be talking about using herbicides to manage vegetation in hardwood forests. Dave's joining us from Penn State University Cooperative Extension, where he's a herbicide specialist, and I'm always delighted to have Dave join us. With that, Dave, I'm going to mute my microphone, and it's all yours. Thank you for being with us.
Okay, thanks a lot, Pete, and thanks everyone joining us today. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started here. So as Peter said, we're going to talk today primarily looking at herbicides from a hardwood forestry angle. So if any of you are on the side of the pine forestry, you're not going to probably see many useful things here today. But with that, we'll go ahead. Here's what we plan to cover today. So competing plants, what are they? The problems and issues and concerns that we have surrounding them. We'll get into control, starting with integrated approach to vegetation. And then we'll focus on chemical control. And we'll look at forest herbicide application methods, what products to use concerning active ingredients, and then lastly, we'll land on some treatment guidelines that you might find helpful. And of course, at the end, we'll open it up for questions. So certainly feel free as we go along to type your questions into the chat pod there, and we will answer those as they come in and try to get to all your questions at the end. So we're going to focus primarily on what we call competing plants, and they cause a lot of concerns for us, and I listed a number of them here. Slow or inhibit regeneration development, diminish species diversity, limit future timber potential, and degrade wildlife habitat. So with all of these issues, brings to the forefront, why we want to manage this vegetation, why we need to control some of these things. And, looking at this issue, we tend to really focus on this one here is competing plants and the regeneration development, certainly. They interfere with the establishment and growth of desirable tree seedlings. And most of the research really focused on the fact that they cast dense shade on the forest floor. So you can see in this image here, this is primarily striped maple and beech brush. In the background there, you can see where the arrow's pointing the dense shade on the forest floor there. In the foreground, you see some fern. The fern hasn't really developed yet, but I'll show you that in the next slide here. But often we refer to these competing plants as interfering plants. So you may see it in the literature. We may see it referred to as interfering plants in the sense that they interfere with the establishment of desirable regeneration. And then here's a stand of hay-scented fern, and you can see the dense shade that they also cast on the forest floor. And you can imagine if you were a seed germinating under there from some desirable seedling, whether it be a cherry or a maple or an oak or whatever it might be, the difficulty of getting enough sunlight to survive and get up through that fern. And I'll show you this image again, so keep this one in mind. I'm going to show you this actually having been treated and what the result was. So we really think of competing plants from the standpoint of the dense shade and the problems that dense shade causes, and seedlings being able to germinate, grow, and develop. What I'm going to do is just quickly go through a series of slides here to show you what some common competing plant species are in hardwood forestry. And of course, I think most of you are probably familiar in northern hardwood, certainly with American beech and the problems that beech bark disease is caused. So when it affects the parent tree, it actually triggers it to send up root sprouts. And so we get these thickets in the understories, and a lot of times we refer to that as beech brush. Striped maple, certainly another one that we have in our understory, is very common. Hay-scented fern. So there's a few ferns. So a lot of folks, I don't want you to be confused where we think like all ferns are bad. They certainly aren't, but there's three that we primarily look at, and these are ferns that we refer to as rhizomatous ferns, or ferns that spread by a root system called a rhizome. Hay-scented fern is one of them. New York fern also looks very familiar to this. So these are single frond ferns, so where they send a frond up from that rhizome, it's just in singular. So that difference being when we look at clump ferns typically aren't a problem, but these single frond ferns, these rhizomatous spreading ferns like hay-scented New York and bracken fern, can be problems in trying to get desirable regeneration established. Grasses and sedges can be a problem. Short husk grass is one that's common on the Allegheny Plateau. And now we're dealing more and more with a grass called Japanese stilt grass, which is quite common throughout central Pennsylvania now. I'm not quite sure if it's reached the New York state border yet, but certainly keep your eyes open for it because it can look very similar to this in understories. Blueberry and huckleberry understories such as this up on the plateau here in Pennsylvania, mountain laurel thickets. There's a lot of work that was done by the U.S. Forest Service that show that these do interfere with desirable regeneration development, and they did some work on herbicide control and some other types of control in mountain laurel. And then things like grapevines, we don't often think of this, but grapevines can be a real problem, particularly in sapling stage forests or pole timber stage forests when they get on top of those trees and they'll end up getting snow or ice on them, and you'll see these stands just completely pulled over and consumed with grapevines at that time. And then, of course, exotic invasive plants. And here you see in this image, this was taken early spring, and the Japanese barberry is just leafing out, and you can see the mat of stilt grass on the ground in front of it. And these plants have just exploded in abundance now through this exponential growth curve. But most of all of you are dealing with some species, I would imagine, of an exotic invasive plant. Quite common across the areas that I work in. Most properties that I am on, we find something there that is not native. And then lastly, we can think about competing plants in the form of poor quality stems as well. So these may be desirable species even, unlike beech, for example, we may have desirable species that are just poorly formed, and these should be addressed in timber stand improvement projects and things of that nature, whether they're herbicided or whether they're simply cut and allowed to resprout, but they can certainly be competing vegetation as well. So understanding the competing vegetation problems. So I pose a question here, why are these plants such a problem today when they weren't at the turn of the last century? So turn of the last century, late 1800s, early 1900s, heavy harvesting across most of our states in the east here. They regenerated, and most of our logging now is occurring on these second growth stands that came back to some incredible valuable species out there. So why weren't these competing plants such a problem during that harvest when they are today? So a few things that I like to talk about here briefly, and we'll have a slide for each one of these, but it really results from what I talk about as these 4 points: shade tolerance, poorly executed harvests, high deer impact, and exotic invasive plants. So let's touch upon each one of these. So shade tolerant. So most competing vegetation is shade tolerant. And over the last 100 years, following that heavy harvest at the turn of the last century, these stands will already have a lot of these species well developed in those understories. But also, a lot of the harvesting that we've been doing in the last few decades has been partial harvest. And partial harvest, as you can see in this image, has just a pocket of sunlight that'll reach the forest floor. And throughout the day, that little patch of sunlight will move across that forest floor. And so the light conditions that we have with partial harvest really also fosters the growth and development of these competing plants, which most are shade tolerant. So things like beech brush, striped maple, ironwood, ferns, as they're all very shade tolerant plants, so they can exist in these understories just fine. The other one, poorly executed timber harvest. So you see in this image here, the large stump right here, this was a northern red oak stump. This is a black gum. And so you can see how poorly formed the black gum stem is there. So this was a high grade where we're taking out the most valuable, commercially valuable species and leaving undesirable trees or trees with low commercial value, often referred to as select cutting or diameter limit cuts. And we can say, you know, it's taking the best and leaving the rest. So a lot of select cut forests are out there now where this has occurred. So it causes a competing vegetation problem. So now we have this black gum, for example, interfering with the establishment of something that might be more desirable. Deer browsing impact. So this is a biggie. Selective browsing by deer affects tree species composition. It occurs over a range of deer densities. So we need to understand that deer are selective browsers, and I'll show you their forest preferences here. So they have highly preferred species, and this unfortunately overlaps almost exactly with what our preferences are for our most desirable tree species. Oak, maple, ash, yellow poplar, all highly preferred species for deer to browse upon. Intermediate in preference are things like black cherry. Then if look at that low in preference list, it almost matches perfectly with the slides I showed you at the very beginning. Beech, striped maple, ironwood, blueberry, laurel, ferns, invasive plants. So that's the biggie that we're dealing with across most of our areas. And I like to use the word deer impact and get away from talking about the numbers of deer, because impact is a function of the density of the deer as well as landscape forage availability. And so even at very low densities of deer on a low forage landscape, we can still have very high impact. So if we put 20 deer per square mile on the landscape, and that landscape has very poor food available for it, so a low forage landscape, the impact can be really high. But if we put 20 deer per square mile on a high forage landscape, so same exact number of deer, put them on a high forage landscape, the impact of those deer would be very low. And so keep that in mind. We want to try to use this term impact. So what's the impact that the deer are having on that landscape, and get away from talking about the numbers of deer per square mile, because it's a function of how much food is available. And then lastly, exotic invasive plants. And so invasive plants have just increased exponentially. They do have these exponential growth curves. So from the time that they're introduced, we just see them exploding. And a lot of them have been around for a long time, and we're just seeing these plants really beginning to show up now because of that growth curve that they have. So an invasive plant is a plant which grows rapidly, spreads aggressively, displaces our native plants, and they come in all forms. So they can be trees, shrubs, vines, grasses, as well as herbaceous plants. So this is an image here of Japanese barberry, a beautiful plant, beautiful fall colors, red berries, looks great in the wintertime, but is highly invasive, still sold in the landscape trade, still used on a lot of landscaping areas, but it does invade the woods. Very shade tolerant species as well. You can see this forest is completely undisturbed yet highly invaded by Japanese barberry. So some of the characteristics that make these plants so invasive is that they reproduce prolifically, meaning they mature quickly, produce large number of seeds, they sprout or resprout easily, and they spread aggressively over large areas by seed, roots, and shoots. And the seed typically disperses away from the parent plant, whether it be by wind or water, or by wildlife like birds in particular, spreading the seeds after they eat them and deposit them in other locations. And they can be very difficult to control. They're introduced either accidentally or on purpose. So a lot of things were brought in through landscape trades or for wildlife even, but they don't have any natural control. So there's no insects, there's no diseases, no other plants that compete with them. And herbivores, our herbivores like our deer, don't like to even feed on them. They're not preferred species because they didn't adapt to these areas. They're not evolved for these areas. And so they can just spread prolifically. So these 4 reasons are really why competing vegetation now is such an issue today when it wasn't at the turn of the last century when the heavy harvesting occurred across much of our region. So let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about control. And we're going to talk about it from an IPM approach, or an integrated pest management approach. And when we talk about vegetation, we're going to use the term integrated vegetation management, or IVM. And when we look at the pyramid, we start at the bottom of the pyramid with cultural controls, and as we move up, we get to more complicated interventions, so mechanical, biological, and then at the top of the pyramid, we think about chemical control. We're going to look at each one of these measures briefly here, and oftentimes what we want to do when we're talking about controlling or managing vegetation is we want to take as many of these practices as we can and integrate them into our management practices. So are the things that we can do that are a cultural approach, are the things that we can do from a manual mechanical means. Not many biological controls out there, but we'll talk about some of those. And then can we also then supplement this with using herbicides, for example. So cultural control, I like to call this indirect weed management. So it's things like, how do we enhance the growth of the desired plants? Can we implement proper harvesting practices? Can we reduce the impact of the deer? So reduce deer numbers out there. Now the impact is lessened, and those preferred species that they desire to browse on might now have a chance to grow and develop. Can we prevent the spread of undesirable plants by eliminating seed sources? So does your neighbor have a tree of heaven or a lantus on his property that we might be able to eliminate it because it's a female tree producing hundreds of thousands of seeds annually, for example? In our planting practices, even in our landscapes, even in our yards, can we focus on using just native plants? Can we reduce seed spread by cleaning equipment or stopping soil movement? One of the things I think about all the time, because I didn't mention this to you, but my brother has land in Steuben County, New York, outside of Bath. And I travel up there often and work on his property and deer hunt up there and so forth. And it always concerns me that maybe I'm going to bring some Japanese stiltgrass seed, for example. It could even be on soil that's on the bottom of my boots, for example, where I can move that seed to his property. Or is it on my truck? So if you're moving equipment from a piece of property that has a certain invasive on it, make sure that you clean it off. Make sure you're not moving contaminated soil or seed on that piece of equipment that might introduce that new invasive plant onto a new property. And then lastly, minimizing disturbance. There's many woodlots that I've looked at for folks where it was pretty much, I've said, hands off here, let's get these plants under control before we do any kind of disturbance, because they're just going to explode when we come in here and we open that canopy up. So minimizing disturbance can be really important until you get these things under control. Manual mechanical control, things like hand removal, using equipment, whether it's a weed wrench, chainsaw, brush cutters, those kind of things. Small infestations or small plants, young plants, oftentimes when you learn to recognize them, you can just pull them out of the ground. I manage a demonstration forest down here that's 150 acres for Penn State, and I'm doing a lot of herbicide work out there. But anytime that I'm out there and I see a small oriental bittersweet or a bush honeysuckle, for example, I'm pulling those things out of the ground. And then lastly, mowing. And mowing is often necessary in a lot of these overgrown areas, old fields, abandoned agricultural fields, things like that. And it's really just kind of the first step. It gets us in there, provides us access, but it almost always needs to be followed up with some type of herbicide treatment, because what happens with all of these practices, whether we're cutting or mowing, is these things typically just resprout. And so it isn't really an end-all means here unless you're getting that root system controlled, like pulling it out with a weed wrench. But cutting oftentimes gets you that first step. It might help level the playing field a little bit for you, but you've got to be sure to come back and address those resprouts, because most of these things are going to resprout. What about biological controls? You know, and this is something that's really probably the answer for most of our invasive plants. But we need to have these natural pest controls out there. We need to have these insects or diseases that are going to help keep some of these things in check. Very few of our invasive plants do we have these things available for, and I show a couple of them on here. So tree of heaven, there has been a wilt disease that has been discovered that impacts tree of heaven. It is right now in the process of trying to get it labeled to be a biocontrol pesticide, but that labeling is going to take some time. I know it has also been discovered not just in Pennsylvania, but also in Ohio as well. And so that's something that's going to really help us to control tree of heaven. And then rose rosette disease, I'm seeing this quite frequently now. I also see it in New York State on my brother's property. And so I've seen it completely kill some multiflora rose, but then it seems like every time I see one die, I see 5 more popping up somewhere else. So I'm not sure it's super successful. It is a viral disease that is spread by an insect, a mite actually, and it has actually moved here naturally. It wasn't an introduction. In fact, neither of these were introductions. They were both discovered here occurring naturally. And then what about grazing by livestock? And this is an image from the Goats in the Wood project, which actually was a Cornell and in partnership with Penn State project, I believe. A lot of folks are interested in this kind of project because they want to look at something other than the use of herbicides. And so more and more folks are turning towards being able to fence areas in their woods, whether it's invasive control. In this case, this was looking at meat goats to control striped maple and beech brush and understories and see if they were selective to those species. You know, you do have to move these out. You have to graze them for only so long and be able to move them. So a lot of work. I'm not sure it's the answer. I'm really not convinced, particularly from an invasive plant point of view, that these things are going to do the trick for you. But a lot of folks are interested in trying this. So lastly, on that integrated vegetation approach, we land at the top of the pyramid, and that's with the chemical control. In this case, we're talking about herbicides. And I say that herbicides are productive, effective, selective, low risk, and then I put necessary. And we'll hit upon each one of these, but necessary meaning when we look at all of these other control measures, we oftentimes land here as the necessary approach because it's productive with limited budgets and limited manpower. This is really going to be our most productive approach. Effective, we have lots of research now that shows how to control these things using herbicides, what active ingredient to use, what rate to use, what time of year. Colleagues of mine and colleagues at the Forest Service have done a tremendous amount of work looking at everything from beech brush and fern to tree of heaven and Japanese stiltgrass. So we know how to control these things. Selective, we can look at selective application methods as well as selective products. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how these herbicides are applied. And some of them are very selective in that they're going directly into the stem that we're trying to control. And then lastly, we say low risk. A low risk to you as the user and low risk to the environment. And so it's a whole nother talk. In fact, on January 2nd, I'll be giving that talk if anyone's interested in another webinar series that I have. But that's our introductory presentation is the environmental impacts of using forestry labeled products. And so we can talk more about that if anybody has questions. So how much is too much? So when is competing vegetation a problem? And these are some guidelines that I'll share with you from the U.S. Forest Service work that was done primarily in Allegheny hardwood stands, but I think it applies across most forest types. With native plants, if 30% of the more of the area is stocked with competing plants, then adequate desirable regeneration is not likely to develop, and competing plants are likely to dominate the understory following a harvest. So 30%, that's kind of that magic number. We're talking about native plants. And then I posed the question with exotic and invasive plants, and what is the number there? And I used to tell people that it was if you had any. Just by pure definition of the word invasive, we know if we have some, they're going to spread and they're going to become a problem. So if you have an area that is not invaded, I would say you probably can make sure that it stays that way. But most people are already dealing with some form of invasive plants already on their property. And so you really have to, what are your expectations, and be realistic about that. What is going to be your approach? Can you actually eradicate them? Most likely that's going to be very difficult, and you have to be able to tolerate them at some level. But control is still something that you're going to have to be looking to do, whether it's annually or whatever your program might dictate. And then this is, so I showed you that understory with the mist blower treating that. This is what it looked like following the treatment. And so what I tell people is control the competing vegetation and then let in the sunlight. So this understory, this forest was proposed for harvest. You can see the timber is marked. You can see the yellow paint marks on some of the trees there. Had that fern understory, as well as a mid canopy of less desirable shade tolerant species. Mist blower was run through here prior to the harvest. So before any amount of sunlight was put in here, that understory was treated. So control the vegetation and then let in the light, or you're going to really be dealing with more problems than what you'd really like. So how are forestry herbicides applied? So lots of different methods. We're going to go through these here and show you how to apply some of these products. And we're going to look at these 4 primary means. So foliar spot and broadcast applications, basal bark, axe frill, or what we call hack and squirt, and then stump treatment. So we'll go through each one of these here briefly. So foliar spot applications using just a backpack sprayer. You can do a lot of work with a backpack sprayer and be really effective. So we're looking at even coverage. Do not spray to the point of runoff. This is probably the most common approach that people are dealing with, whether it's a patch of fern or whether it's a multiflora rose. These are spot applications where you're going up and just targeting those individual plants, those individual undesirable plants that you want to control. You can be very target specific, and you can really minimize damage to desirable plants that might be nearby by really directing your spray appropriate. Versus something like this where we're doing broadcast applications. So these are using mist blowers or air blast sprayers mounted on like a track machine like you see up there. That's a KMC track machine that Forest Regeneration Services uses. And you can see the mist that's coming out there, or a backpack mist blower. This is a fella out of the area that I work in here that actually carries a tank that he carries on his front here to kind of balance the weight from the machine, which is actually a modified leaf blower that he uses, and he injects the spray right into the end of the leaf blower. But these are non-selective, so that mist is very difficult to control exactly where it's going to go. So if you have desirable species in that understory, chances are, it's going to be controlled along with the fern or the invasives that you're trying to deal with as well. So these spray both ground vegetation and understory trees up to 20 feet high. And depending on the density of the vegetation in the understory, you can see how wide of a swath in an open area where this is just being calibrated in a parking lot. But you can have a swath that's from 40 to 80 feet wide that something like this can take out in a day, or in one pass, I mean. So here's an area that was treated using an air blast sprayer. You can see on the left there, the untreated, and you can see the dense shade still in the understory, and you can see that mid-canopy layer that has been eliminated over here in the treated side. You can see the amount of sunlight that's now coming in here just by taking out that low shade. And actually, if I showed you an up-close picture here, in fact, it's my very last slide I'll mention, but the black cherry that germinated on this understory just by removing that low shade was just amazing. So here's that fern picture. Remember I showed you that low shade underneath that fern. That was where I zoomed in on that image. But this is the start of the second growing season where we treated that fern. And these are literally hundreds of thousands of black cherry seedlings that germinated just by removing the shade from that fern. This was a broadcast application, but that seed had not germinated, and it was underneath that fern, stored in that soil. And just getting that sunlight in there allowed it to take off. Basal bark treatments. This is another very selective approach where you're just targeting that stem. You're spraying that lower 1 foot to 18 inches of the stem from the ground line up, completely around the stem. Used for treating thin bark trees, generally less than 6 inches in diameter. When you start to get into those larger size classes, you're really going to be better off to switch to an application that we'll show you here next, I believe, where we're using a hatchet to frill the tree and squirt herbicides into the cuts. So this is also good for year-round application. So unless you have snow preventing you from spraying that stem to the ground line, but otherwise you can do basal bark applications year-round. The label will actually tell you if the stem is wet then not to apply, but I can tell you this was a site where we had a white oak overstory with a red maple understory, and we treated the red maple on this site. And in fact, immediately after I treated this, the thunderstorm rolled in, and I thought, oh no, that was a waste of time. But a year later, these red maple stems were all controlled, and that low shade was removed on this site to allow for some oak regeneration to occur. So the axe frill or hack and squirt. So let me define frill for you. So a frill is a downward angled cut. So you can see how I'm holding the hatchet here. So that's the downward angled cut. We want to create that cupping effect to hold the herbicide in there. I use an axe with a ground down bit. This was from a Forest Service study where this bit is 1.75 inches wide, so 1.75 inches wide. On these larger trees like this is American beech that we're frilling. It really allows you to create that narrow cup that you can then fill with the herbicide. If you're using a longer blade, it tends to open those cuts up a lot more on the edges and allows the herbicide to spill out. So something to keep in mind, if you're doing a lot of hack and squirt, you may want to grind the bit down to create a narrower bit to create that cupping effect. Used to control trees anywhere, an inch and up. I've even hack and squirted smaller trees. Just by nicking the bark, it's enough to generally get enough herbicide into those small stems. The cuts must penetrate through the bark into the sapwood, and my rule of thumb is use spaced cuts. So we want to leave some bark intact between our spaces to allow for herbicide translocation down to the roots. And then the number of hacks is based on the diameter of the stem, so 1 per inch of diameter. So if you have a 6-inch tree, you're going to make 6 frill cuts and then spray the herbicide into each one of those cuts. And then the last application, again, another very selective type of application where you're going through a 2-step process where you're cutting those stems because you don't want the dead standing stem there, and then you're treating that cut surface. So on small stems, you're going to apply a water-based material immediately after it's cut to that freshly cut surface, and you treat the entire surface, even on these small stems you can see here. But then on larger stems, you just need to treat that outer layer of wood from the very edge of the bark all the way in, and you need to treat what we call the phloem, the cambium, as well as that sapwood or xylem layer that's actively growing. So what do I use? There's lots of different products out there, and it can be quite overwhelming and intimidating even. But I will suggest that we look at things in this way. So the first answer to that is that we want to use products that are labeled for use in your state. And I believe Peter sent out a list for New York that shows, because New York does have some different restrictions on some products there. So you need to make sure it's labeled for use in your state. The other thing that you need to look at, because all these active ingredients now have come off patent, there's lots of similar products that have different sites that they're labeled for use on. And if you're going to use this for silvicultural operations in the forest or in the woods, you need to make sure that it has that actual labeling on the site. So it has to be labeled for use in the forest. And another thing I would suggest that we use products that are non-restricted use. And we have a slide here where I'll cover that, but we don't have to use anything that is a restricted use product. So we can tell everyone that everything that we do in the forest are using products that the general homeowner can purchase and apply to their own property. And I'm going to give you 3 active ingredients that I would say that we could do almost all of the work that we need to do with these 3 active ingredients. So glyphosate, example product would be a Cord XRT2, which is a surfactant loaded, ready to go product basically. You don't need to add anything else to it, just dilute it to the proper concentration and you're ready to go. Whether you're doing foliar sprays or hack and squirt, triclopyr comes in 2 formulations, a amine or water-based formulation and an ester or oil-based formulation. So Garland 3A is the amine formulation, or Garland 4 Ultra is the ester or oil-based formulation, and then sulfometron methyl. Example of that would be Oust XP. And again, all of these have come off patent, so you can find these products with lots of different names with the same active ingredient, even the same percentage of active ingredient. Oust XP, I'll show you here, is one that we use for grass control or broadleaf weed control, and also has soil activity and works on seed germination as well. We call that pre-emergence activity. So let's just get back to this point about use classification here. So we said we want to use general use products. So every pesticide is classified by the EPA as either a general use product or a restricted use product. So general use does not require certification when applied to property owned or rented by applicator employee. Now that's how the regulation is written for the state of Pennsylvania. And so you need to check how that is regulated in your own state, but that's how it's written for Pennsylvania. So as a landowner, I can purchase these general use products and I can apply them to my own property. An example that I like to give would be, I can go to Lowe's and buy wasp and hornet spray, but that is a general use pesticide. I cannot take that wasp spray over to my neighbor's property legally and spray a wasp or hornet nest on their property. Okay, they would have to do that themselves. And so that's how general use products work. You can apply them to your own property. You will not see anything on the label that says this is a general use product. But with restricted use products, you will see something on the label. It looks like this. So these products, in order to purchase and apply them, it does require certification. So even if it's on your own property, you still have to be certified in order to purchase and apply restricted use products. So we don't need to go there, but you'll see that on the label if it is restricted use products. In New York, also, just to be clear, New York also has a few products that would be considered general use in our state, but they have additional restrictions on some of those. And I know we shared that list with folks who registered. So what to use? So we're looking at foliar applications now, whether it's spot treatments or broadcast applications. We can use all 3 of those active ingredients. A few caveats here. So glyphosate, remember I said a Cord XRT2 is already surfactant loaded. This is a broad spectrum herbicide. It'll control everything from annual and perennial weeds, grasses, and woody plants. Triclopyr, the amine formulation for foliar applications, it is selective to grasses. So if you had an area with some grass that you wanted to keep, it will just take the broadleaf weeds out and the woody plants, and it will leave the grasses. A lot of triclopyr products have pasturing or have pasture labels, so that it's selective to grasses. Sulfometron methyl is completely different than the other 2 in that it is a granular. It's not a liquid product. When you measure out ounces, you're actually measuring them by weight. But it is a broadleaf and grass herbicide, and also has soil activity, and as I said earlier, pre-emergence activity, so it'll work on seed germination. This is one that we use a lot for Japanese stiltgrass control, for example, mile-a-minute vine control, is another good one, because those are both annuals, and we want to have something in the soil that's going to affect seed germination. What about cut surface applications? So things like stump treatments or hack and squirt frill girdle treatments. The product that I like to use most oftentimes is glyphosate. Controls numerous woody species, everything from beech to birch it'll take care of. It is weak on maple, so if you were treating whether it was striped maple or red maple, this is probably not going to be your product of choice. You probably want to use something that I didn't list here, and it was based on some studies that I've done on red maple and some Forest Service studies on striped maple, but you probably want to use an active ingredient called imazapyr, found in products like Arsenal AC, for example. And then lastly, basal bark applications. So triclopyr ester formulation, the ester formulation of triclopyr found in the Garland 4 Ultra or the ready-to-use product called Pathfinder 2. There are also some generics of all of these as well. So again, this is used on thin bark trees. And so if you were going to do basal bark, that's what you would use, would be the ester formulation of triclopyr. So what do I need to get started here? And I list just some simple things, and we'll start up here on the upper left here. So your backpack sprayer certainly is something that you're going to want to invest in, a nice solo piston pump backpack sprayer, as well as the shoulder saver harness. So if you're going to fill this thing up with 4 gallons of liquid and have all that weight on your back, you're going to want to use something like the shoulder saver harness, because what you're going to be able to do with this waist belt here is carry that weight on your hips rather than up on your shoulders, and that's going to really save you. You know, I always joke that once you fill this up with these straps that go out in one day, you'll never want to put it back on again, but this will really help you. The other thing that I do with the shoulder saver harness is, see this buckle right across the front here, is actually put a roll of flagging right in on that buckle there. And so as I'm spraying and I'm marking things that I've treated, particularly when I'm doing spot applications on invasives, I can tie some ribbons or pieces of flagging on things to make sure that I'm marking what I've treated. You're going to want to invest in a hatchet and a spray bottle if you're going to be doing any kind of hack and squirt work here. And again, that ground out bit might be something that you want to consider. Personal protective clothing, you know, be sure and read the labels so that you understand what it is that you need to wear from a personal protective point of view. But I will tell you, the products that I have shown you, what this individual has on in this image is what you're going to need to wear. So the label is going to tell you long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes and socks, rubber gloves, and some are going to tell you to wear eye protection. Particularly when you're looking at products like Garland 3A, which has a danger as the signal word. That means it can cause severe eye irritation or skin irritation. So when you see that signal word on the label, make sure that you're protecting your skin and that you're protecting your eyes. And I would suggest to wear eye protection no matter what when you're working in the woods, and particularly when you're mixing concentrates. You know, it's always a good idea to have those goggles on. A couple things down here that you really want to invest in to modify your sprayer. So when you get that wand from your backpack sprayer, you can change it out, especially if you're going to be doing any amount of basal work at all. I would suggest that you buy this low volume basal wand. It's going to be a great investment for you. Change the tip out to an adjustable cone. You're going to want to have a bunch of different sizes available. I use the smallest aperture for basal bark work, and then for foliar work you can use a larger aperture, but these are adjustable so that you can spray it as a nice fan, kind of a mist spray, or you can also turn it right down and get a stream or a jet to spray up high onto some larger targets. With this check valve, you can put this right at the tip there, and it's based on the pressure of the backpack sprayer. And as soon as the pressure goes down just a bit, this check valve will kick in and it'll shut it off right at the tip, which is what this basal wand does already. But you can modify just a regular wand by putting this check valve with the strainer right in there. And that way, when you're walking from one plant to the next, you're not dripping any herbicide out on the ground. And then, of course, storage containers like this so that you're storing your products properly as well. So invest in some of the leak-proof storage types of containers as well. So that's really what I would suggest you need to get started. And then choosing the right forestry herbicide and application method. So some things to consider here, some food for thought about, okay, when do I do a foliar, or when should I do a hack and squirt, or when would I maybe say, oh, basal bark would be better for this? So here's some things to consider here. So as I said earlier, we want to look at products that are general use products. So we can purchase these and apply them to our own property. We want to make sure that they're labeled for the site that we're applying them to. This is really important that you understand that you don't buy a glyphosate product that doesn't have a forest label. There's a lot of things out there that are labeled for agriculture use, but if we're going to use them for silvicultural applications in the woods, we need to make sure that it's labeled for that particular site, or it's not legal to use it. So selectivity. So this tells us two things. Number one, we can make very selective application methods. So versus using a mist blower like this, which is non-selective, versus doing a hack and squirt, for example, where the herbicide is very selectively applied only into the stem that we are treating. So we can be very selective in our application approach, which actually really gives us a good name in how we're applying this. So if anyone is a little concerned about the use of herbicides on their property, we turn to a lot of these selective approaches, because that way we can say, well, we're only putting it in that stem that we're trying to control. The other thing about selectivity is that we can use selective products. So we can use herbicides that only kill grasses, for example, or we can use products that only leave grasses, for example. So there's some chemistry out there that allows us to be very selective. We can use products that only work on seed germination. And so if it's already existed, it's already growing, it will leave those alone, and it will only affect a seed that tries to germinate. So be concerned about non-target plants. So presence or absence, do we have a lot of desirables out there that we need to be concerned about whether we're going to spray them? So then again, we want to use some of these more selective application approaches. Even if we're using a backpack sprayer, we might say, well, I'm not going to use a mist blower now. I'm just going to use a targeted spot application to control these things, because I have all these desirable plants out there, these non-targets that I want to make sure that I don't damage. Then activity, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but one of the things we need to understand is that herbicides have different kinds of activity, whether it is pre-emergence activity, which is the one we mentioned, so it can work on seed germination in the soil as they begin to emerge. But we also have to be aware of products that have what we call soil activity. And so Azapir, for example, is a product that has soil activity. And glyphosate is a product, for example, that has no soil activity. So if you put a Mazapir down in your forest understory, it has a really good chance of being taken up by the roots of desirable trees and killing something that you really didn't want to be. And so don't be treating invasive plants under an understory of really desirable plants using a Mazapir, because you're going to end up taking out the overstory more than likely. So you need to make sure that you understand the activity of the product that you're using. So in that scenario, I would say let's use glyphosate or triclopyr, and we can treat these invasive plants in our forest understory or the fern in that understory and not impact any of the overstory trees, because there's no soil activity with glyphosate. And then a few other things that really dictate the application method: number of stems, the size of the plants, the number of acres. Those kind of things are really going to dictate whether you're doing a backpack treatment or switching to something that's maybe more mechanized, for example, or whether you do a hack and squirt versus a basal bark application. You remember, basal bark, to my mind, are going to be low numbers of stems, generally very small stems. And I'm going to switch to a hack and squirt when I get larger numbers of stems and larger stems in general. And of course, number of acres, that's going to dictate whether it's mechanized or whether it's hand control oftentimes. So just to wrap things up, here's some of the treatment guidelines that we like to summarize here. Use most effective herbicide for controlling the target species. So as I mentioned, a lot of research has been done, so we know what the most effective herbicides are. Use the herbicide at the lowest rate that will provide optimum control. apply the herbicide at the optimum time of year. So there are some real specific times of year, depending on the plants that we're trying to control, that where they really work best, and you can use them at these low rates. Follow prescribed application methods on the label, follow all label precautions, and be patient and be persistent. So give this stuff time to work, but be persistent with it as well. And I'd like to leave you with this quote here from Miller and Miller 2004, and just keep this in mind. The objective of herbicide use in forestry is not to achieve the complete weed control routine as in row crop agriculture, but rather to provide a temporary growth advantage, months to a few years, for the crop trees over their competition. Always read and follow the label before applying any pesticide. And then here's a good reference to get you started. So this is a publication that I wrote with Dr. Jim Finley here at Penn State. It's entitled Herbicides and Forest Vegetation Management. You can Google that or go to the Penn State Extension website, and you can find that on there. You can download a PDF, or you can order a hard copy if you'd like to have it. This is the last image I'll leave you with, and we can open it up for questions, but this is a site where the black cherry germinated on it. I showed you where I had the treated and the untreated side there, and this was immediately following the treatment that we had the cherry germination on there. So with that, Peter, we can take some questions.
Dave, great. I like that picture of all that cherry. That's if every time it works so well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there are already lots of good questions. I'm going to exercise my host prerogative. I get asked the first one, and that's also gives everybody a chance to type in questions that they might have. So my question is, when you're doing basal bark on beech saplings and pole-sized stems, and you talked about doing basal bark up to 6 inches in diameter, does that, if you do a basal bark, do you know, does that trigger root suckering? Because it's not going to control the root suckers, but I'm wondering, do you know, have you ever worked with it or looked at to see if it triggers root suckering?
So when I did my basal bark rate study, we treated American beech, and we came back to those sites. So it was a little over a year following treatment. We didn't come back any longer than that, Pete. But a year after treatment, we did not see any kind of resprouting from that. And those were on 3 different sites that we looked at over a year later. So I didn't see any response there that triggered any kind of sprouting.
Okay.
But you're right, though. The Forest Service and the studies that I've done both showed that treating those sprouts in the understory, the herbicide is not translocated to the parent tree. And so we were able to treat literally every sprout underneath parent trees and leave the parent tree completely alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in areas where you have healthy beech, that's sometimes a desirable thing to do.
Yes.
Okay, so you mentioned your 3-part forest herbicide series. I posted that information in the chat window, and I will send, Dave sent me an email that has all the details. I'll send that to everybody who's registered, as well as to the to my webinar lists. So you all will get information on that. The deadline to register, I note, is December 28th. So
that will be your Christmas present.
Yeah, right. So I think you probably covered this, but Eric asked earlier, what do you recommend as the herbicide active ingredient for basal bark sprays?
So herbicide active ingredient for basal bark would be triclopyr ester formulations. And so the most common product would be Garlon 4 Ultra, or the ready to use would be Pathfinder 2. So no mixing required with Pathfinder 2.
So can you use Garlon 3A as a basal bark?
No, that's an amine formulation and only goes into water.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Tim wants to know what makes the herbicides blue.
And I'll back up just one clarification on the triclopyr too. So the basal bark applications, you're mixing those in a basal oil, So I would suggest folks buy commercially available basal oils, like something like Arborchem sells, for example. The label will tell you that you can mix it with kerosene and diesel fuel and things like that. But I would suggest that you buy the basal oil, and you can buy either mineral or vegetable based oils that you can use.
We,
And
we've bought oils that are, so we've bought the commercial oils and they come, either you can get them tinted red or blue. They
yes,
still they have an aroma that I don't find offensive, but some people do. In an area where we were doing some research work, we actually bought low odor vegetable oil based commercial oils. And it was a little more expensive, but there's almost no smell when you were doing the application.
yes, yeah, absolutely good point. And wear rubber boots.
Right.
You will get it all over your leather boots, and you don't want that.
You look like a Smurf.
And so what makes them blue is the dye that we put in. And you mentioned that you can have a dye that goes in the oil that you can have. Typically the ones I've seen are red, but there's also a blue dye that I use in my water-based formulations for all my foliar and hack and squirt treatments. I put the blue dye in there. And so you need to purchase those dyes. It really helps you see your applications.
Okay, and you mentioned the summary sheet that I did for the New York herbicides, and I just finished that. I have not yet sent it out. I'm going to let it simmer for a couple of hours, and I will send it to everybody who's registered for the webinar so that they have access to that. And that's just a simple summary sheet of some of the products that Dave was talking about here.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to point out is that with New York, which differs than my state, is that some products that we have as non-restricted use, New York restricts the use of those, and you can't access those without a certification.
Right. Okay, Lee wants to know if you can provide a recommendation for an herbicide and a treatment method to control stiltgrass.
Yes. Stiltgrass is a tough one. So I gave you 3 products that I would suggest that you have in your tool belt, and one of those being the sulfametron methyl, which has a forest label. It has soil activity and it has pre-emergence activity. And so anytime that I'm dealing with stiltgrass, that's what you need. Now there are, grass specific products out there. You can even spray it with glyphosate, but keep in mind when you're using those kinds of treatments, you're not affecting seed that's stored in the soil. And the biggie with stiltgrass is that its seed stores in the soil for years, and you have to get rid of that seed bank. Unfortunately, we haven't found anything that gives us longer control than, say, 2 or 3 years. In most cases, that window is long enough to get you what you need. But in a lot of cases, especially where deer impact is really high, you're going to be seeing the stiltgrass come back with a vengeance. But I would suggest that you use sulfametron methyl. You can apply it as a pre-emergence very early in the season before it even comes up while seedlings are dormant, particularly if you have a lot of desirable seedlings present. Or you can apply it even mid to late summer and still get control of it, because the window really is that we want to get it before it goes to seed again, and it's a very late seeder. The seed doesn't form on it until probably October even. So as long as you're getting under control before it goes to seed, that's the important thing.
And so the sulfametron methyl, a common product for that is
Oust XP.
Oust XP, which in New York is a restricted use product. So that means you have to be a certified applicator to purchase or apply it anywhere. Lee, I'm remembering, is maybe from the Midwest. So every state has their own label details. And so each person needs to look into the details for their state. Okay, Wayne wants to know, I got a follow up to this, so before you answer, Wayne wants to know what herbicide you'd recommend for Phragmites. And there is, Megan offered a link to greatlakesphragmites.net/herbicide. So that is an option. I don't know, Dave, how much time you spend working with Phragmites.
Yeah, it's not one I'm familiar with, Pete. I do have a colleague by the name of Art Gover that does have a series of fact sheets, and I can check here to see if that's one that he has available on his website, and I can share that if you'd like.
Okay, so Megan did share that link
Oh,
with all panelists and attendees,
okay.
so they can look in the chat window for that. So, all right, Jason wants to know, and this is appropriate for Dave, who is now the official spokesperson for Atlantis in Pennsylvania, wants to know if you can offer suggestions or recommendations on how to effectively control Atlantis, which is also known as Tree of Heaven.
Yeah, so we just updated our Tree of Heaven fact sheet, so you can search for that on the Penn State Extension website if you'd like. But Tree of Heaven is a different beast than most species that we deal with. It is a root-suckering species, even different from American beech, because one of the things that we looked at, and Peter, you did the study, or a study, I'll say, on American beech, where you treated the stumps of parent trees and got really good control on root sprouts. With Tree of Heaven, when we treated the stumps of parent trees, we got zero control of root sprouts.
Wow.
And so it's a very different beast. You really need to use the mechanism that the tree has in its own system, which means it's the phloem cells that move herbicide downwards to the roots. So the key with this tree is to control the root systems. We can only do that by keeping the phloem cells intact. So imagine those being straws basically that connect the leaves to the roots. And we're going to get the best movement late season. So we suggest hack and squirt, basal bark, or foliar applications. You can use glyphosate late season, so no earlier than July 1, right up until fall colors begin to occur. So if you start to see fall coloration, don't treat it. And so they're mid, to late summer applications, and no stump treatments. So don't cut off that mechanism that moves the herbicide downward, and you can be really effective at controlling that tree.
Okay, and I just found the fact sheet posted on October 8th of this year, and so I put the link at in the chat window towards the bottom. Okay, let's see. So Stephen has some more questions about Phragmites. Unless you want to, so he wants to know about swiping non-native Phragmites with imazapyr. They've used rodeo, which is glyphosate, but it doesn't kill the roots, it'll always kill the shoots or the rhizomes. So do you want to defer to the information that's available elsewhere on Phragmites on that, Dave? Hello? Hello?